Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and today I'm going to be reviewing Warhammer Age of Sigmar, The Rise and Fall of Anvalor, published by WizKids Games. Warhammer Age of Sigmar, The Rise and Fall of Anvalor is a tower defense game that is basically about building up the city of Anvalor and then earning prestige during enemy assaults that are meant to take it down. In the multiplayer version of the game, you win just by having the most influence at the end of the game. In the solo version of the game, however, you need to survive the entire game with at least one of these city buildings still intact. This is actually a two-sided board, so you have a 1 to 2 player side, and if you flip it, there's a 3 to 4 player side, and the game actually offers you quite a few choices during setup. You'll always have a draw pile of city buildings and then a city board that you can purchase those buildings from, but you have 6 different factions to choose from, and they all have these different colored, different shaped tiles. For this sample, I'm going to be rocking the Free Guild. You also have 3 different enemies to choose from. In this case, we're going with Korgos Kulgortide, which just sounds kind of cool in a horrible way. But you have other choices as well, and these enemy factions will also have their own sets of tiles. One thing that's super cool about both the faction you choose and the enemy that you play is that you each have an aspect that can make the game harder or easier. The enemy ones are called battle cries. So at the beginning of the game, you'll be selecting from levels 1, 2, 3, or 4. The one you choose will give the enemy a special effect and determine what happens when you roll a 6 for them. For your faction, you'll also get to choose an aspect card that gives you a special ability to use throughout the game. So basically you're looking at a lot of variability every time you set up the game, because you not only have different factions and enemies, but each of those is going to have some different special powers depending on what you choose during setup. For actual gameplay, you're always going to have a hand of 5 tiles, and when you look through your hand, you're going to have some sort of combination of buildings and units. And on each of your turns, you're basically going to either place a faction building, place a faction unit, choose to place one of the city buildings over on the city board here, or pass, which allows you to kind of get rid of tiles from your hand that you don't want, redraw, and regroup. But of course, nothing is for free, and what that means is that each and every one of your units and buildings has a cost. The cost of anything can be found in the top left corner, and you pay for those cards using resources that are displayed in the top right corner. So for example, we know that our warrior priest requires 2 manpower to put out, so we would pay 2 of our tiles that have a manpower symbol on them in order to place the warrior priest. The other thing that's interesting about all of your tiles is that they have special abilities. So if they're units, they might have special abilities in battle, whereas buildings can either offer additional resources or support for units that are fighting. As you play, you're going to want to be strategic about how you place your different units out on the map. I should note, by the way, that these 1-player spaces are for the 1-player game, but the ones that say 2-player are for 2 players. So the board will help you determine where you can place things. But these main tiles in the middle are where you're going to be arraying your own forces, and meanwhile, enemies are going to be collecting on the outskirts. Normally in a multiplayer game, you're able to put off the gathering of enemies at the edges of your city for a little while, because they only really start to appear when you have placed a city tile out on the board. However, in the solo game, to keep things challenging, you're going to place an enemy every single turn. And once 3 have built up on one of the sides of the board, then you're going to have an assault. Basically, whenever the enemies prepare, you roll a d6, and on a 1 through 4, you place an enemy on a corresponding side of the city. 5s and 6s are determined by the battle cry that you pick for your chosen enemy. So let's say that 3 enemies have built up on the 3 side of the board. When you initially place them out, you don't actually turn them over and see what they are, and you don't find out who's coming for you until there's actually enough buildup for an enemy assault. Then what will happen is you'll actually flip all of the enemy faction tiles, and let's say that this is the board layout. What's basically going to happen is that every single one of the enemies is going to keep advancing until it either dies or moves all the way to the other end of the board, in which case it will leave and you're then able to start rebuilding for the next enemy assault. So an enemy assault is a whole process where enemies advance, dice are rolled, special abilities are activated, and you see who's left after the enemies have rampaged all the way through Anvalor. Again, in the multiplayer game, you win solely based on the amount of influence that you've earned compared to other people, but in solo, you have to make sure that at least 1 city building survives the end of the game, and then your score is the influence that you've accumulated during the course of play. For those of you who are interested in tracking your progress in solo games, there's also a solo sheet that allows you to record your score based on what enemies you played at what level and using different factions with different aspects. And that's a quick overview of the Rise and Fall of Anvalor. So now for some final thoughts. First, the good. Overall, Overall, I like Rise and Fall of Anvalor. For a game that's so physically heavy, it's actually pretty light and snappy, but still with some good choices to make. I think my favorite thing about it is the variation among factions and enemies, with several factions to choose from as a player, and several groups of enemies to pitch yourself against. There is a lot of replayability in the game, but there's also a sense of mastery as you explore and become better at playing certain factions or anticipating the dangers of certain enemies. In addition to the choices that you can make in terms of what faction to play or what enemy to fight, the Rise and Fall of Anvalor is also a very fun spatial puzzle. Learning how to place units and buildings next to each other in ways that are smart, mutually beneficial, and helpful in combat is really enjoyable, especially after you've played a few times and you feel like you really know what you're doing and like you can anticipate the next enemy onslaught. I also just really enjoy games where you buy cards with other cards in your hand, or in this case, tiles. Having to sacrifice tiles from your hand in order to play the one that you want adds yet another interesting layer of decision-making to Rise and Fall of Anvalor, because for everything that you want to put on the board, you have to give something else up that might also have been desirable. That's something I really like in a game, and I was really happy to see it in this one. That said, Rise and Fall of Anvalor is not a perfect game. It can feel a little thinky at first, but soon the right moves become fairly obvious. And even if you're making them, the fact is that you are still subject to the whims of a die roll. Even your best laid plans can get wrecked by bad rolls. And while that element of luck serves to make the game move quickly and make combat very efficient, it can also make it feel like all of your really good strategies were for nothing. I also think that there could have been slightly better interaction with enemies. When you place enemies on the board, they're initially face down, so you can't really plan for what's coming in the next attack. I think that as planning heavy as the game feels when you're taking your turn, it'd be really nice to be rewarded for that a bit more when you're attacked. Especially because, as I mentioned, combat is just resolved by a die roll. I also think that it's possible that enemy interactions could have been a little more interesting. Just having your enemies plow through the city and then run off into the horizon if they survive is okay, but I can't help feeling that there could have been something more interesting in play. Overall, however, Rise and Fall of Anvalor is a fun game that I've enjoyed my time with. So I give it a 7 out of 10 and a Dice Tower seal of approval. Happy gaming.